Hello, and welcome to this webcast presented by the New York State Department of Health and the Institute for Disaster Mental Health at SUNY New Paltz, with support from our colleagues at the State Office of Mental Health. I'm Carla Vermeulen, Deputy Director of IDMH, and I'll be moderating today's event. This is the 11th annual webcast the three organizations have collaborated on. This year's event is a follow-up to last year's webcast, which described the experiences of two survivors of mass shootings. That one was intended to make it clear why it's so essential to consider mental health reactions when planning your response to disasters, regardless of your role or agency. This year, we're getting back to basics with a panel representing some of the key organizations involved in disaster response in New York State. We have leaders from the American Red Cross and the New York State Office of Mental Health Bureau of Emergency Preparedness and Response, who will explain how they prepare, deploy, and manage personnel throughout an operation, and they'll discuss specific examples of responses that went well as lessons learned. Our panelists are going to introduce themselves in a moment. First, just some brief technical notes. We have about 400 people registered today, so we're using a platform that doesn't allow members to turn on your cameras or microphones. You can enable closed captioning if you like by clicking the Show Captions button, which should be on the bottom navigation bar of your Zoom window. The chat function is not active today, but you're encouraged to submit questions at any time via the Q&A function. That will be monitored by my IDMH colleague, Andrew O'Mara. So he knows he can jump into the discussion if there are any time-sensitive questions, and otherwise we should have time at the end to respond to audience questions. This session will be recorded and made available on the Department of Health Learning Management System, as well as on the Institute for Disaster Mental Health YouTube site in a few days, in case you would like to rewatch or share it with anyone. So with that, let me bring in our expert panelists for introductions and discussion. So first question, we'll just go through each of you in turn. Could you briefly introduce yourself, explain what your role is, and then describe some of the functions and services your office or agency might provide to survivors of a major disaster? So we will start with Pat from Office of Mental Health.
Sure. Good morning. My name is Patrick Riley. I am the Emergency Manager and Emergency Response Coordinator for the Office of Mental Health in the Bureau of Emergency Preparedness and Response. So OMH, along with 28 other state agencies and several non-state agencies and organizations, is part of the Disaster Preparedness Commission. As such, we assist in providing emergency response and support to communities experiencing disaster. Through the DPC, OMH contributes to the overall state comprehensive emergency management plan. OMH also provides representation to the State Emergency Operations Center via two of the emergency support functions, both ESF 6 and ESF 8. At times, our liaison will act as a facilitator for ESF 6 during those incidents, and ESF 6, which is mass care, provides wraparound services to disaster-affected people and communities. As an agency, we may be requested to offer resources like transportation, meals, or manpower. OMH also assists in the planning, setup, and development of disaster resource, family assistance, and reunification centers, as well as many other types of response efforts. Our main support resource for these centers is the provision of disaster mental health. And we do this through support via our disaster mental health teams. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Skip.
Great, thanks, Pat. Good morning, everyone. Skip Zimmerman here. I am the Disaster Mental Health Program Coordinator for the Office of Mental Health. I'm also in the same bureau where Patrick is housed, and that's the Bureau of Emergency Preparedness and Response. So Office of Mental Health also provides disaster mental health responders who can assist survivors of disasters. We have 23 teams located at our psychiatric centers. Those are all over the state, and they're deployable by Office of Mental Health upon request from the New York State Emergency Operations Center. So our team members are trained to support not only disaster survivors, but particularly those with existing mental health diagnoses, and along with really anyone experiencing acute stress reactions after a disaster. So that includes first responders and recovery workers. We also provide training and technical assistance to counties that are interested in developing or even further supporting their own teams. And I just want to make a note here that disaster mental health support is really meant to provide short-term and immediate compassionate care. We know that early non-clinical interventions for traumatic stress reactions can really diminish the need for deeper and longer-term care needs and the development of more intense anxiety, depression, or stress disorders. And with that, we can move on.
Good morning. I'm Jerry DeLuca. I'm the Division Disaster Director for the American Red Cross. The division of the American Red Cross that I work with runs from Philadelphia to Maine. We're organized in 9 different regions, 3 of them in New York State, the Greater New York, Eastern New York, and Western New York regions. And those are the folks that provide the hands-on, boots on the ground emergency services that the Red Cross provides. We also have a staff person assigned permanently to the State Emergency Operations Center, working with the ESF 6, 8, and 11. So we work with Patrick frequently. We are also the only statutorily mandated member of the Disaster Preparedness Commission that is not a state agency. And we respond to various incidents. We're best known for sheltering, feeding, and housing people during the time of disaster. But some of the services that we really provide and are extremely important, one of which is disaster mental health. We bring in people for all kinds of disasters, from the smallest to the largest, as well as health services and spiritual care. And we provide financial assistance to folks after a disaster. So that's our primary mission and where we get started.
Great, thank you all. So next, getting further into nuts and bolts. So we'll go through with each of you again. So how does New York State currently access disaster mental health teams for a large disaster response? So for this one, we will start with Jerry for the Red Cross perspective.
Sure. Oh, disasters, as I said, come in many sizes. We categorize them from a level 1 to a level 7. A level 1 would be a simple single family fire. To the people that live in that home, that is a disaster. And we are organized and come out to those kinds of events based on a call from the fire chief or the county fire coordinator's office. And we will send a disaster action team out to meet with that family and provide immediate assistance, financial assistance, offer mental health services, offer to obtain replaceable durable medical equipment if they've lost medical equipment in the house fire, and provide those services. But when any disaster occurs that's larger than that, larger than a single or multifamily fire, we're activated by the county emergency managers or through the State Office of Emergency Management. And we're called upon to come out and provide all those same services through that effort. And I think we go to Pat.
Yep.
Yeah, much like Jerry was just discussing. So when a community has an incident or disaster that exhausts their resources at the local level, following ICS and NIMS protocol, they'll reach out through their county emergency manager to the State Watch Center and the Emergency Operations Center. The EOC then fields a request for things like disaster mental health response. Then the EOC then will reach out to OMH through New York Responds, which is their incident tracking system. And through that, the OMH liaison will then in turn relay that request to our disaster mental health program coordinator. Skip.
I just want to jump in with one quick point on that. So Pat referred to the ICS system. For people who aren't familiar with that, that's the Incident Command Structure, I think is the S in that.
Yes.
And that is basically the kind of federal FEMA organizational structure that's supposed to be applied in any disaster. Training in that is highly recommended, just so, whatever your role in disaster response, just so you have an understanding of kind of what the roles and hierarchies are. That is one of the resources that was on that list that got sent out to everyone. It's a free online training through FEMA. It takes 1 hour to 2 hours, and definitely worth doing just to have that bigger understanding as well. Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Carla. That's a great description and a great lead into what I wanted to talk a little bit about is when Patrick receives the request through the incident command structure, which we think is the best way to activate any of us, right? That comes to me, and then we would then typically develop our response from there. So that typically comes from the local incident commander or from the county emergency operations center that goes up to the emergency operations center at the state level and then over to us. So if incident command is not evident, or if it's a smaller scale event, we just want folks to know that you can also communicate directly with your local Office of Mental Health field office, who can also activate our program, the Disaster Mental Health Program at OMH. So when we're activated, we quickly develop a plan, and then we seek permission to deploy. So we've got to have that layer of approval, and then we canvass our teams for availability, and then finally we deploy. So that can take a couple of days or so, and we just want people to realize it's important to make the request early in the response because of that.
Which leads us directly into our next question. So what would you all say is the appropriate point for an emergency manager to be considering the need for disaster mental health resources? Patrick.
Actually, I think I'll pass this one over to Skip. We had kind of had this one set up for him to answer.
Yeah, great. So thanks, Carla, and thanks, Pat. So really, the earlier the better, as kind of we said before, right? But certainly, as soon as the scope and the nature of the incident is clear, including the number of people affected, or when there are indications that recovery is going to be protracted, that it's going to be a long time and people are going to suffer through that, we want to be able to activate this. So even small scale events can really have a deep impact on those that are affected, as Jerry pointed out, right? And these can have deep impacts on the responder community as well. So we never really know how many people, even with pre-existing mental health conditions, are going to be affected. So it's really better to be safer than sorry.
I'll add to what Skip talked about. From our perspective, the plan, it should happen now. It should be part of your plan, your emergency action plan for any community. Anticipate the need, because it will be there. Anytime there is a disaster and people are impacted, we see the need for disaster mental health, and then for long-term mental health. If after the immediate situation and the immediate help that we're going to provide in the Office of Mental Health and the other responders are going to provide, people are going to need long-term care, and that should be planned for as well. This situation, I've been involved with some where we're years in ensuring that people are receiving the proper mental health assistance that they're going to need. So start your plan. Don't wait until an incident happens. Develop it into your plan ahead of time, so that when something does happen, you know who to call and you know how to call them. And it's not a reaction, but it's an action.
Yeah, maybe I'll follow on with that too. Jerry, certainly has mentioned the incident command structure as well. So this typically gets lit off by a county emergency manager or the incident commander. But just to reiterate what Jerry has said here, disaster mental health really should be part of any jurisdiction's emergency response plan, in addition to things like sheltering and feeding and rescue and things like that. This is an important piece of the puzzle. So we want you to keep in mind that psychological first aid, which is really the modality that we use when we're conducting disaster mental health activities, it's primarily an early intervention. So we need the space to conduct that early in the response. And then what we'll do is we'll create referrals for longer term needs. So typically that's back into the local community where there are services available, et cetera. So we're there to give survivors a chance to really express their concerns in a way that really can reduce their need for longer term support, or they can identify the need for longer term support.
Carla, can I add on that we too are there for the short term? The Red Cross is there for the first initial response, and then perhaps for a couple of weeks afterwards. After that, we too will find local providers that we will work with to refer people to ensure that they're receiving the care that they need.
Thank you. So our fourth question, I think we kind of already covered this, but if anyone has anything to add to this. So is that decision about bringing in mental health resources, would that be initiated by an emergency manager, or is that more broadly considered in the response phase? Anything to add? I think
I'll just add that annually the Red Cross meets with our various emergency managers in a supportive community response on determining what the plan is for everything from sheltering and feeding. This should be part of that discussion. What are your plans? And we will make sure that that discussion happens so they understand the need for this service at the time, and it's developed into their plan.
Great, thank you. Okay, now a long question. Bear with me on this one. So New York State, as we are all aware, is extremely diverse in all ways, geographically, economically, and certainly culturally. So looking specifically at Office of Mental Health, how does OMH take culture, very broadly defined, into consideration when recruiting and training disaster responders? And how do you recommend people in the audience consider planning for those in need in their communities from multiple different kinds of cultural backgrounds? I think we have Pat first.
Sure. So as part of ESF 6, OMH is a part of the planning process for any kind of disaster response. As a result of some of the lessons we've learned from previous responses, considerations have been greatly taken regarding making locations and documentation accessible. Things like transportation, language, and culture are taken into account when we set up things like a disaster resource center. So one of our best examples of this is our response to Hurricane Ida. During the setup and the operation of these disaster resource centers, special considerations were made regarding the populations we were serving. So we looked at things like language access. How would people access the site? So how were people going to get there? So we looked at making sure that these sites were on public transportation routes. We also looked at things like specific religious aspects of the communities we're going into. We printed materials in several different languages, taking into account the main languages that were spoken in the area. We also took into the location of the sites, again, looking at public transportation, but we also set up the signs, the variable message signboards in multiple languages. So it would scroll from one language to the other. So people who were trying to get there could read and find the directions to get to the site. And we tried to make sure they were located as close as possible to the affected area without it being in the affected area. So it wasn't as big a burden for people to be able to get to the resources they needed.
Carla, if I can jump in too and just mention here that, it's important to note here that OMH defines culture pretty broadly, right? So it's not just in terms of religion or geography or ethnicity, but it really also pertains to people's experiences. So when we think about culture, we also want to consider things like marginalized communities or things like social determinants of health, specialized language needs, like even American Sign Language, or the needs of those with disabilities, and then other populations like that, even people who have been incarcerated, things like that, right? So we are really intentional when we're recruiting people for our OMH internal teams, that we're looking for people who can be reflective of a wide variety of communities that we're serving. We also train our folks on cultural humility and awareness, and we recommend a similar approach for county teams as well. And we might be able to help you with that if you're interested. I want to give you an example. So, let's say a traumatic event affects an Orthodox Jewish community or a community of migrant workers. So from amongst our responders, we canvass for Yiddish or Spanish speakers. And then we look specifically for those who may have a better understanding of the cultural norms for those kinds of groups, right? So wherever we go, we try to filter who we're sending through the culture of the community that we're attending to.
Carl, if I can just jump in, I wasn't supposed to be part of this answer, but the Red Cross also takes culture into a very strong consideration. First of all, 90% of our responders to any disaster are volunteers. Very minimal number of paid staff participate. It's all volunteers. So we recruit throughout the various cultures and throughout various communities so that we can try to send those volunteers who are participants in that community to service it. We also pay attention to little things like in our shelters, the food we serve, is it culturally appropriate? Can we provide, especially right now, Spanish-speaking people to assist? We recently opened a shelter for a number of migrants that were all from Ecuador, and they only spoke Spanish. And it wasn't just Spanish, but it was Ecuador, so it's a sub part of a culture. So we try to do the best we can to meet those needs wherever we can.
Great. Thank you all for those answers. Yeah. And Skip, I'm so glad you dropped in that phrase of cultural humility. I think that's recognition. You know, we used to talk about you need to be culturally competent. Well, that's pretty much impossible to be competent in all the different forms of culture you might encounter. So just recognizing that and paying attention to it, I think, is a real positive shift in the mental health field in general and the disaster response field.
Hey, Carla,
Okay.
before we go on, I think there's a question in the chat that's relevant to this discussion. How does OMH meet with, how often does OMH meet with ESF6? And do they share relevant information with their partners and agencies, specifically those that are regulated by OMH, to ensure that they are prepared during disasters?
Sure, I think I can actually field this question. We meet with ESF6 on a regular basis. Most of the time, it's on a monthly basis, at least once or twice a month, where we have different levels of ESF6 leadership meetings. And we do share a lot of the information back and forth with the different agencies that support ESF6. It's a big collaborative effort within that ESF. And we do also share that information back down to our agency partners and to our community partners as well.
Okay, thank you, Andrew, and Patrick. Okay, so next, a sort of a related form of cultural or sensitivity or responding to people's needs. Skip had mentioned the point about health equity and just lost the phrase, the determinants of health.
Social determinants.
Social determinants of health. Thank you for bailing me out there. So Jerry, could you talk about how the Red Cross differentiates between equality and equity, and then describe how this shapes your disaster mental health planning and response?
Sure. There's a clear difference between equality and equity. Let me just talk about a cartoon I've seen, a meme that shows two people standing at a fence trying to look over a fence at a ball game. And one is about 6 feet tall and one is 3 feet tall. And they can't see over the fence. They're given a box that's about a foot high. The 6-footer stands on the box and can see over the fence. The 3-foot person stands on the box, can't see. They got equal treatment, but it wasn't equitable treatment. The Red Cross right now is very focused on equity, making sure people get what they need and not that every person gets the same thing. When it comes to mental health, when it comes to other types of services. The only thing that is not even equal anymore is financial aid. It will depend on the size of the family, what we give. So we're trying to be more equitable and not just equal. We're also working to be transformational, not just transactional. Everything is not just give people something that can help them in the immediate need, but how do we help them at the long term? How do we provide them guidance and assistance, both from a financial perspective, from a mental health perspective, as to what they need long term? How can we guide them to find that additional assistance? In addition to that, we have teams throughout the country now specialized in assisting communities. Right now, like we have one in New Jersey that was working with a food bank that to help build a ramp so they could get more pallets of food into the food bank as opposed to offloading it. That is a transformational change for them. We're looking to do the same thing for services and not just provide immediate help. That's where we are right now.
That's great. And that something we've been talking about a lot at the Institute for Disaster Mental Health is, the position in the disaster mental health field was always, here's someone's baseline level of functioning. They go through a disaster, they have a decline in functioning, and we want to help them get back to baseline. Well, is that good enough?
No.
If someone's baseline was not real great to begin with, are we doing them a service by returning them to that? Our executive director, Amy Nitze, was involved through the American Red Cross. She did a response to one of the California wildfires a couple years ago, and she tells the story of one of the people that this was during the pandemic, and so they weren't doing congregate sheltering. They had people in hotel rooms. One of the people she met trying to provide disaster mental health services had been previously unhoused, and now he had a hotel room to himself. And that was a great improvement for him. Getting him back to his baseline was not going to be doing him a service. So I think it's good everyone's thinking about this in these broader terms.
Yeah, I'll give you another example of that. I recently served as the Family Assistance Center manager in Hawaii after the fire. Bringing those people back, over 8,000 people that were displaced, to their baseline was not going to be good enough. We need to help them. There were many people that were previously unhoused that we were trying to find a new housing for. We put them up in hotels for a short period of time, for a number of months, but how do we get them so they have a long-term permanent solution? And that's what we're working on. And we continue to have about 700 people in housing in Hawaii.
Oh, goodness, thank you for that example. Okay, moving on. So does New York State currently recommend training for responders, supervisors, staff, et cetera, in your respective program area? We know the answer to this is absolutely yes, but if you can elaborate on what that looks like, we'll go to Skip and then to Jerry.
Yeah, I needed to unmute. Yeah, thank you, Carla. Yeah, so we absolutely do recommend training. And in fact, the training that we're using is the IDMH training that you designed and others in your shop, Carla. So thank you for that. So our training involves really a two-part curriculum. So they start with psychological first aid and then move on to what's known as the fundamentals of disaster mental health practice. So those are taught over 2 full days, one day each. Psychological first aid really offers the basics of how to show compassionate care for survivors of disaster or traumatic events. And then the second part, the fundamentals class, expands on those by teaching how clinicians and practitioners should approach short-term interventions in that disaster environment. And that training actually includes a simulation of a disaster mental health activities in a resource center, in a disaster resource center. So in addition to that, we know that disasters don't happen every day. So we want to keep our folks engaged in this throughout the blue sky times, right? So we're offering a number of ongoing opportunities for responders, including some specific topic trainings and some learning collaboratives to help people keep engaged. These topics include items like working specifically with children and families or other specific populations, providing mass care after, providing care after mass violence events, or working with any specific kinds of populations or circumstances. We're also supporting a couple of really exciting events. I want to plug first off the IDMH conference, which is an annual conference showing up in just 2 weeks, May 14th and 15th. And so we're supporting that, and we're bringing folks from our teams to that event. And we hope all of you will consider coming as well. We've begun to plan also what we hope is the first of many practical experiences where we're going to be able to use the New York State Preparedness Training Center in Oriskany. And we can actually practice our disaster mental health skills with their trained role players. And that's very exciting for us as well.
Yeah, and I think, to my knowledge, the current OMH training program is probably the broadest, certainly since after 9/11. This is under a SAMHSA grant with some pretty generous funding that's allowing OMH to offer a lot of these trainings around the state. So very exciting.
if I can just interject one other, I think, it's also recommended that folks who are participating in these kinds of activities have an understanding of the incident command structure. So taking at least the basic courses that are offered by FEMA, ICS 100, 700, those are also important.
And I'll just,
Jerry,
before we, oh, go ahead.
yeah,
Skip.
I was going to say, Pat might have more to say about that, but I just thought I'd plug it.
Yeah, it's just one of those things where when responding to an incident, it's more important to understand what our responders' role is in the bigger picture. And part of recommending those incident command structure, national incident management system trainings is making sure they understand what to expect when deploying to a larger scale event that could involve multiple levels of coordination, such as a disaster resource center or a family assistance center.
Great, thank you. Before going to Jerry to hear about the Red Cross training program, I'll just build on Skip's plug for the IDMH conference. So as he said, it's May 14th and 15th. That is going to be at the Culinary Institute in Hyde Park in the beautiful Hudson Valley. And the focus of it is going to be on responder wellness. So, how do we support and train and take care of ourselves in doing this very challenging work? And there is free sponsorship thanks to Office of Mental Health. So if you go to newpaltz.edu/IDMH, you can get all the information about registering. So, all right, plug done. Over to you, Jerry. Thanks.
Our training is very similar. We are very much a training-based organization. In order to occupy any position, you have to have the training. We start with the same psychological first aid and disaster mental health fundamentals. Those are two of the classes. Any of our health services people, not just our mental health people, are required to take the psychological first aid because they're going to be working with folks and they might just need to be able to assess and then refer. So that is included as well. We also require that our actively working mental health professionals are just that, professionals. We require them to be licensed professionals. They can have various different mental health licenses, can also be a school psychologist or a counselor, a psychiatric nurse. And even if you're not working currently, but held that license and are a retired mental health professional, very often those are the folks that come and volunteer at our events. We also do some hands-on training. We will be holding in June, the last week or first weekend in June, a disaster training institute. And that's where we bring people together for various areas of training, from housing, feeding, etc. But we're going to be holding a mass casualty incident training specifically, and then an exercise, a full-scale exercise of setting up a family assistance center and operating it and what needs to be done there. So a lot of our mental health volunteers will be attending that for not only the book learning, but the hands-on training that helps them understand and operate, because unfortunately we have too many mass casualty incidents these days. That's it.
Thank you, Jerry. And if anyone is interested in becoming a volunteer with the American Red Cross, there's a link for how to do that on that resource sheet that you received yesterday as well. Okay, next question. Could you briefly describe some of the planning and preparation efforts your agency is engaged in to support the mental health needs of both responders and survivors? And I think we've got Skip first for that.
Yeah, thanks. So our current approach involves continued recruiting and training to bolster these existing teams that we've got here at OMH, because really the more responders you have on your team, the better position we are to respond in a really robust manner. So as I've outlined, we're also providing continuous engagement opportunities for team members to help keep their response capabilities fresh, right? So we've also renewed our focus on team member self-care and self-care tools. We ask folks to think about and plan for what they need for self-care during a response. How do they keep themselves centered? How do they keep themselves quiet and calm so that they can have that kind of influence on those that they're interacting with, right? we consider self-care to be a requirement for the job rather than a recommendation. In fact, our responders and supervisor are instructed and trained to take regular and frequent breaks to ensure that they're in the best position to support the people who are really struggling with stress reactions. I want to point out too that the OMH website contains disaster mental health resources for the public. We're also developing our own internal website. It's called a SharePoint that contains dozens of resources for our responders so that they can grab those, from when they're deployed, when they're on the ground, they can use those and they can distribute them to people as needed, etc. Behind the scenes, we have warehoused supplies for responders as well. So these include things like comfort blankets, some plush toys for children. We've got some sensory and fidget items that people might find helpful. There are some other tools to support people as well that we bring when we deploy our teams. We have a number of handouts from SAMHSA and FEMA that can also assist survivors in times of disasters and throughout their recovery. And then finally, we maintain an up-to-date local mental health referral list per county for our responders so that they can make those referrals fairly quickly as people identify needs. One other thing I think I want to talk a little bit about here is the idea of a culture of preparedness. We want our responders to be prepared enough during a disaster that even if they and their families are affected by the disaster, that they can peel away and come out and help us support communities that need support. So we recommend that all of our responders participate in the Citizens Preparedness Corps training. That can, you might, if you're aware of that, that's offered both virtually and in person around the state, and it's a great training opportunity for anybody.
We too are very much involved in recruitment. Right now we're in what we call spring into action. It's a heavily heavy recruitment time to try and prepare, because for us the biggest season of all is hurricane season, and we're preparing for hurricane season, which starts on June 1st. Although this year we may see some prior to June. Right now we've got people deployed to multiple disaster responses in the Midwest, in Oklahoma, Texas, because of the tornadoes that just happened. So we're constantly recruiting new volunteers. And as I said, we're 90% volunteer based. And I'd encourage you to go to that website that was given to you, because we're looking for volunteers every day. And then we are deploying them and preparing them after we train them to send them out. We have a large number of people that are involved in the training and operation of every entity. And disaster mental health is part of our integrated disaster care. It works with our health services, our spiritual care folks, and our disability integration teams, because that is often part of an effort that we sometimes forget, the people that are disabled. At our Red Cross shelters, we must be accessible. It's a requirement. But one of our teams in Eastern New York, our disability integration team, is putting together kits like Skip just mentioned, with blankets and plush toys and sensory kits, so that we can make sure that we're helping those that need the most help.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah, we at IDMH, we often describe the going back to the responder self-care side of it as an ethical imperative. It's not something selfish or fluffy or coming last on the list. You have to actually pay attention to it if you're going to be able to stay and not get burned out or vicarious trauma and all of that. And so I think there's been a
I'm sorry, one thing I forgot is, we have both service associates and certain supervisors and then managers. So we have various levels of people in each area. And the service managers and the supervisors are required to self-assess themselves, but also their teams, to make sure that the teams working under them are taking care of themselves. So while they're checking on all the staff that's assigned, we also have them make sure they're checking on the mental health staff to make sure they're not becoming overburdened.
That's great. Yeah. And that's another reason why if somebody wants to volunteer, doing it through an affiliation with the Red Cross or another organization is so important. So you have a supervisor. So you have someone, you're getting the training, you're getting the support, the camaraderie. That's why we always say spontaneous volunteers, well-intentioned, but not actually helpful typically. Right, thank you.
Quick question. There's been actually a couple of questions that I think are all kind of getting to the same thing here. The first is, how can people get access to these trainings? The second is, how can people get access to some of these exercises that you guys are talking about? And the third is, can there be a list shared afterwards of all of the trainings that were mentioned? People said that there was quite a few.
Well, from the Red Cross perspective, become a volunteer and we'll train you. We provide the training. In order to attend our exercises and our trainings, you have to be a volunteer with the Red Cross. It's easy to do. It doesn't cost anything, and we're happy to have you.
And I'll add to that if I can, Carla and Andrew, for a couple things. If you're interested in the ICS, the Incident Command Structure training, that's all available through the FEMA website. So just go in and Google the training there and you'll find a wide variety of opportunities there. For those that might be interested in the psychological first aid or the fundamentals of disaster mental health training that we're providing for the OMH teams, I mentioned this briefly in an earlier question, and I'll just kind of underscore it again. We are also providing that training to counties that want to develop teams or want to pivot existing teams into disaster mental health. So all you need to do is contact us. And I think our contact information is available on that resource page, right? So contact me or Pat, and we will work with you to develop your team and to provide the training at the county level for you. So it's going to be limited to that. It's not just open to the public, but we'll work with the county county leadership to ensure that that's available for you if you want it.
And on the DOH side, there's a number of PFA resources. There is a recorded version of a web-based kind of, it's like an hour and a half long, so it's concise. That is available through the learning management system already, and I'm sure we can get links to that to everybody. And then we're also going to be doing 3 live virtual deliveries of PFA on May 21st, June 3rd, and June 14th. I don't remember the times of those offhand. Maybe we can put those in the Q&A or something. But if someone wants to do a virtual version of those, again, that is like an hour and a half long version. That version is meant for people who don't necessarily have any mental health background, unlike the OMH version, which is meant for mental health professionals more because it is then leading into the more advanced disaster mental health. So just depending on your background and your level, there's a lot of options available. I think the main thing is find the one that's right for you and do it, because it's super useful, not just in disaster response, but anytime you are interacting with people who are stressed or distressed. It's just really basic kind of supportive interaction guide kind of stuff. So yeah, thanks, Andrew. Thanks for that question. That's very important. Okay. Next planned question is, what is the significance of disaster mental health preparedness to a community's overall resilience to recover from a disaster? And that one is for Patrick.
Actually, I think I'm going to defer to Skip on this one as our disaster mental health coordinator.
Yeah, thanks, Pat, and thanks, Carla. So yeah, so it's critical because psychological first aid really provides a basis for the long-term emotional resilience of communities, right? Supporting its members to really embrace that long-term recovery and the process of rebuilding their lives from a position of strength. So through what's called psychoeducation, we can help to normalize and minimize some of the unfamiliar and even disturbing stress reactions that people can exhibit. And we help people identify signs that they may need longer term support. We help them to know that what they're experiencing is really often temporary, but that if it's unaddressed, it can lead to deeper needs, right? So we can help them identify coping strategies that have really been shown to minimize those impacts. One of our priorities is to educate community providers on the mental health impacts of disasters, as well as to equip our responders with those local referral lists that I mentioned before for longer term care. In our conversations with counties, it's becoming more and more clear that disaster mental health is developing as a priority for them as well. So we're seeing initiatives for more local teams emerging, and that's happening rather rapidly.
Great, thank you. Okay, next, have you seen any examples during your career that could be viewed as a best practice for long-term recovery? And I think we're staying with Skip for that.
I think I'm going to pitch that over to Pat. Actually,
That's fair.
Sorry.
It's all right. Things move fast in disaster mental health. So yeah, sure. Three of the best examples I can think of in terms of an OMH response with disaster mental health are the Schoharie limousine crash, COVID, of course, and also the TOPS event in Buffalo. So during quickly following the Schoharie limousine crash, OMH responders, disaster mental health responders, were called in, and our responders were on site and able to provide crisis counseling and support for family and community members, as well as a link to follow-up supports following that initial push to assist folks. Those initial interactions and connections to longer-term support provided to be extremely important for all those involved. Pivoting to COVID, during COVID, obviously everybody knows a presidential declaration was made. So the Stafford Act states in part that all requests for a declaration by the president that a major disaster exists shall be made by the governor of the affected state. This allows them in turn to promptly apply to FEMA for immediate support as well as a long-term recovery support. So OMH, in coordination with FEMA and SAMHSA, were able to put in place Project Hope, which was a crisis counseling program, and that allowed us to provide support to all persons dealing with the pandemic and the associated traumas. In addition to dealing with the daily stressors of the pandemic, a major storm, Hurricane Ida, impacted the Hudson River and downstate regions. So DISHES and OEM, in conjunction with FEMA, set up disaster resource centers. These disaster resource centers, with them came requests for disaster mental health response and assistance. OMH personnel, alongside with the Project Hope personnel and American Red Cross personnel, were able to provide crisis counseling to those in need who showed up at those disaster resource centers. We were able to provide crisis counseling at the sites themselves. This crisis counseling support was instrumental in assisting New Yorkers with the compounded stressors of a storm during the pandemic's ever-changing landscape. This support also continued for 2.5 years with additional support from the Office of Mental Health. Post-COVID crisis counseling program, we were able to continue supporting programs in regions that were greatly impacted by the COVID pandemic. The last example, and certainly not the least, was the TOPS event in Buffalo. So due to its nature, the response was heavily supported not only by SAMHSA grants, but also by state funding. This allowed for the creation of a resiliency center near the event, as well as additional training for community members, a focus on assisting high-risk youth and families in East Buffalo, community youth engagement programs through partnership with schools, community mental health, and other stakeholders in that community. So we're able to provide longer term support for those that were affected. And from there, I'll let Skip go ahead with.
Yeah, so as we said, that the best practice is an early intervention to minimize the need for support around longer term reactions, right? Even things like anxiety and depression. So through early intervention, we can help people avoid deeper stress reactions, including things like substance misuse, higher suicide risk. Short-term interventions then followed up by the referral to local support for longer term needs is also the best practice there. Another best practice is to really be mindful of the balance between recovery and resilience benefits of community gatherings, such as vigils or celebrations of life, memorials, things like that, right? Anniversary dates. We want to be mindful that those events can also trigger trauma and stress reactions for many survivors. So there's a balance to be struck there. And then finally, a best practice is to make sure that there are adequate local resources for long-term support. And that's not always the case in every community. So we want to pay attention to that as well. And I wonder if Jerry might have something that he'd like
Just
to
a couple of items. First, from our perspective, is cooperation and coordination with both the State Office of Mental Health and the local county mental health offices to make sure that we're all working together and making sure we're not duplicating services, but are providing the proper services. That is definitely a best practice. A couple of brief examples. I'll go back to Hawaii again, my time there. The cultural impact in bringing in people. When we came into Hawaii, we brought mental health professionals from all over the country in. But the culture of Hawaii is very different than any place else in the country. So we needed to make sure that we incorporated and worked with community agencies that could both advise us as to how to best deal with the families and the people in need, and to provide those long-term services. So that is definitely a best practice. And Pat mentioned the word Community Resiliency Center. That is extremely important. In Lewiston, Maine, where I unfortunately had the opportunity to run the Family Assistance Center after the shooting there. After we were preparing to leave, establishing that Community Resiliency Center so that the people had a place to go for whether it was social services, but very much importantly, mental health services, and for both referrals and immediate assistance. Because sometimes after the first 10 days, people don't realize their need, but that resiliency center is there, and that has become a best practice for mass casualty incidents.
And I will just bring up, I was very involved in the Buffalo, in the training efforts in the Buffalo community, because it very quickly became clear that there was a lack of representation of community members. And so we sort of pivoted and really kind of revamped our existing psychological first aid curriculum to make it much more culturally appropriate. It had to be very mindful in pairing me with a member of the community to do these trainings. So those were those community-based trainings that Pat talked about, where we wanted to have it not just be the outside experts coming in, but building that capacity at that community level. So we were training people in PFA from the faith community, from arts organizations, youth organizations, et cetera. But boy, was that an experience in cultural humility for me, for sure, and a very powerful lesson, absolutely. Okay, next, broad question for each of you. So how have you seen consideration of mental health impacts change throughout your career? So I think we're starting with Skip.
Yeah, thanks. I think we have seen some change. A number of recent crises have really brought mental health and the support people need to the attention of the entire country and by extension the world, right? We had COVID. We've seen crises around youth mental health. We've seen crises around opioid deaths. We've seen crises around suicide. We see crises around loneliness. And we're starting to really get our arms around crises that are happening in the responder mental health arena as well. Those have all increased awareness and have really helped to minimize stigma, which I think is an important barrier to recognize. That's led to the expansion of peer support and paraprofessional services, in addition to those provided by professionals, as well as a surge in focus on the mental health needs of the responder community. So I'm really grateful and glad that we're going to be at the IDMH conference talking about that specifically with so many people. I think all of these are really welcome developments. The fact that awareness is increasing and stigma is decreasing, just really, really important to note.
I will jump in on that point specifically. Prior to my time with the Red Cross, I'm a retired police officer and been a volunteer firefighter for many, many years. And elimination of the stigma of the need for mental health assistance is growing. The emergency service personnel, the fire service in particular, has seen way too many suicides, and the police officers as well, and all emergency first responders. And there is finally a willingness to accept help and not feel that there's a stigma attached to it. And that has been a huge change in just the last few years that we never saw when I first became a police officer or firefighter. So that's huge. And I think it's going to have a very positive impact on emergency services.
Yeah, and if I could just, I'd agree with both Skip and Jerry. In my career as an emergency manager, and like Jerry, also a firefighter, but also in my time in the military, the consideration of mental health wasn't always there. But I'm happy to say that there's been a definite shift in the attitude of the first responder, emergency management, and military communities regarding mental health and the stigma surrounding it. I think that through our shared experiences of different things like COVID, many of the different emergencies that we've had across the country, and the daily compounded traumas that a pandemic brought through the time that we lived through that, social media campaigns and mantras of things like "it's okay not to be okay," "reach out if you need help," or something as simple as "I've got your six," have shown that there's a push to normalize seeking help and also to identify those who may need support in advance. And I'd also agree with Skip that the development of things like the peer support programs is another welcome resource to so many out there.
Yeah, that's definitely consistent with what I've seen throughout my disaster mental health career, which is 15 years or so. It's also very fortunate, right? The position the New York State is in right now, because the current commissioner of DISHES, which is the Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services, Jackie Bray, she's very committed to responder wellness and mental health. And they're another sponsor of the IDMH conference. And we've been doing a lot of trainings with them as well. So having that, tone from the top effect is very, very beneficial. And, I think we're not over the stigma in certain populations yet, but definitely moving towards that for sure. Okay, so our last planned question, and then we will open it up for some audience questions, is just generally any closing thoughts about the future of the part of disaster mental health in emergency preparedness and response. So I think we're starting with Pat for this.
Sure. So the availability of mental health resources and that gradual acceptance of disaster mental health as an important part of emergency planning and response is a step in the right direction. The fact that it's becoming more important for survivors and responders alike to be encouraged and able to access mental health support is extremely, extremely important. And it's very encouraging to see that we're moving towards that direction.
Yeah, I think the message that we'd also like to convey here is that for those that want or need it, we want you to know that help is available. And that's both for individuals and for communities. And we want you to make sure that it's part of your planning. If you're in a position to do planning for a local government or a local agency, please make mental health and disaster mental health support part of your thinking when you think about how you're responding to events. Not only can we bring our resources to you during responses, we can actually be part of your response if you'd like, if you need, but we can also help you build your own local resources through training and technical assistance. And primarily I'm speaking to our county leaders who may be on the call. So please be in touch with us and let us know where we can support you and where we can help. We can bring training and we can bring that technical assistance to bear. And all boats rise when we change the level of the water together, right?
As I said before, disaster mental health is very much part of our response to every disaster. It is a focus of the Red Cross, both to the clients impacted, the staff, and first responders that we're working with and responding with. So continued efforts on behalf of all agencies and continuing to work together with our agencies and the local county mental health providers to ensure that we're planning and preparing ahead of time, and then having the number of people necessary to respond. So.
Great. And my understanding of the history is starting in the 1980s, the American Red Cross was really sort of pioneers in incorporating the DMH side into the actual physical responses. So been building up to this for quite a while for the Red Cross for sure.
It's definitely not new to us. So,
All right, so that is it for our pre-written questions. Andrew, are there any audience questions? And also Tom Henry and Rachel Colburn of Department of Health, if you want to jump in and add any points, please feel free to.
Yes, there are a couple of questions in the chat. The first one, and I think you guys have touched on this maybe a little bit. Can you say more about how the OMH DMH teams, county DMH teams, and Red Cross DMH teams coordinate and work together during an incident deployment? And somebody else relatedly would like to know how OMH and Red Cross coordinate DMH resources during disasters.
Jerry, you want to hit that first, or you want me to take that?
I was going to say, I'll start. We frequently are the first ones deployed, and we will get our teams out there and then reach out to, depending on where it is in the country, whether to the county or state Office of Mental Health, through the county emergency manager and through the state Office of Emergency Management, depending on the size. We are a short-term solution. So we're going to reach back to the folks who are in the communities to provide that long-term solution. We'll meet with them, talk with them, and coordinate primarily through ESF 6, which Pat has mentioned, and Eric Guiney, who works with me at our state EOC, will coordinate and talk together to make sure we're coordinating our efforts. Pat?
Yeah, like Jerry was saying, OMH works closely with the American Red Cross during any EOC activation that we're recalled to. So when resources are needed, there's always an open dialogue between our liaisons at the EOC regarding any kind of disaster mental health response. And based on the resources that are needed, if one team is shorter on personnel than the other and there's a need for help, we're always willing to step in as long as there's a need. And there's a lot of coordination that goes on, and we're very, very cooperative with, like Jerry said, the local mental health community as well as the Red Cross. We try to coordinate as best we can.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that we know each other, that we're always talking, right? And that's really important for any agencies that are co-deployed, things like that. I will say that a lot of that coordination is about the avoidance of duplication, right? We want to make sure that we're not doing the same things in the same spaces, that we're supplementing each other, that we're assisting each other. So there may be, I mean, just depends on the size and the scope of the event, but there may be one of us, Jerry, might send his folks in early, and then we'll go in and spell them, or vice versa, right? There might be some coordination like that. And I think most of that coordination really does live with the emergency managers on the ground, right? It's the incident command and the incident commander that determines what's needed and who responds. We're just available to respond as the Red Cross is. So if we get called, we respond. If Red Cross gets called, they respond. If they are responding and we are responding, we're going to talk to each other as we're doing that to make sure that we're not duplicating services.
Yeah, it's a great point. There's the old line about the time to exchange business cards is not at the scene of the disaster.
Right.
Very, very, very true. And I will do another plug for the IDMH conference. It's very interdisciplinary. We have people from the mental health side, healthcare, emergency response, all of that. So it's a great way to kind of reach across the aisle and make some of those connections in advance, for sure. Andrew, any other questions?
Yes. And Jerry, I think you touched on this a little bit just in your previous response. But somebody's asking, I'm curious, how do people that need long-term mental health care find an available provider and pay for those services? Short-term care is provided as part of the incident response, but I'm not aware of any long-term programs specifically for uninsured, underinsured, and rural communities without providers, etc.
Correct. You're right. We provide the short-term emergency response. We will then work with the local or the state mental health to identify providers in that community that can accept patients and work with the people on the long-term basis. Providing financial assistance is not something we do for that long-term care. That would be up to insurance, Medicaid, Medicare, in those services. And then, I'll let Pat and Skip speak to whether or not there are other financial ways that assistance can be provided.
Yeah, I'm not sure there's a great answer to this. I think we're all keenly aware that in some parts of the state and in some parts of the country, the availability of services is not as great as we'd like it to be. I know OMH is working hard to increase the number of providers around the state and in communities. We're supporting new providers. We're asking providers to expand capacities where they can. That's an ongoing effort, and we know that it's not as robust as we'd like it to be, but that's a big long-term effort as well.
Andrew, other questions?
Yes, there's a couple here. I find DMH is seen as a separate function, yet I believe we have a role to play from the start in operational planning and tactics. Do you have any suggestions as to how to get the higher ups in operations to include DMH in the overall operations strategies from the beginning?
I think as an emergency manager within an agency, and any agency and any community, it's always going to be kind of a battle to make sure that folks understand just how important disaster mental health is. But making sure that you look at it as a toolbox. Every response needs the right tools to respond to at whatever incident it may be. And as an emergency manager, you will have to look at the whole community when you're looking at that response. And part of it is, unfortunately, we look too much at the response in and of itself and look at it, whether it's a car accident or a large house fire or something like that. And as soon as the accident's cleaned up and as soon as the fire is out, a lot of first responders think, okay, we're done. That's it. But the crisis lasts long after that initial response and that initial scene. It's those folks that are suffering long term after that incident that you have to take into account. And the one thing that I've spoken to people in my own county emergency management as a firefighter is the fact that you don't want it to turn into a much larger and a much longer incident. And if you can bring in disaster mental health in the beginning of a response or at that initial recovery phase, and you do those short-term interventions, it can, in the long run, help those folks not necessarily have those long-term mental health issues going forward. It's a preventative measure to assist folks.
From our perspective, disaster mental health is not a secondary thought. It is part of the initial series of services that we're going to provide upfront at a disaster. Like I said, everything from a single family fire to the major hurricane that can take place. And as we mentioned earlier, making it part of the planning as we are working with emergency managers is part of that, to make them aware that it is something that needs to be part of the plan and not an afterthought. So we're going to continue to do that through our supportive communities response plans and through our actions from the Red Cross.
If I can jump in too, I think, Carla, if you're feeling resistance to this in your community, right? If someone in a leadership role is resistant to the idea of adding mental health and disaster mental health to your planning or to your thinking, that may be a signal that some of these stigmas still exist in some communities, right? So one of the things that OMH is doing as we're providing these trainings and the capacity to build teams is that we're taking a two-prong approach. We are speaking not only with emergency managers in communities and really offering these opportunities to them and getting their thinking, but we're also talking with the local directors of community services, the DCSs. So they're the mental health folks, the local government units for mental health. And so if one is not receptive, the other usually is. And what we're trying to do is encourage counties to bring both of those apparatus to the table and to the conversation, so that they are working in coordination to think about mental health for a variety of populations. So whether it's the first responders and supporting them, or people who have suffered through the disaster experience or the traumatic event, or even their loved ones, people who care about people who have been affected. I think once we get a chance to tell the story, we can identify the need, and that does help convince people that are maybe a little bit resistant to this. And I think, frankly, we're seeing a lot less resistance than we had thought we might even see as we embarked on the project. So that's a good thing. I hope it is for us.
Thank you. I think we have two more questions here. The first is, what strategies can you suggest for handling disaster mental health in the homeless population?
Jerry, is that something you want to tackle? No, he says no. Well, look, so what we do is we're going to deploy our folks to wherever we're asked to be, and usually that's going to be a place where people are gathering after a disaster. So it might be a shelter, it could be at a disaster recovery center or some resource center that's set up, but it could also be at things like community vigils or other gatherings, even anniversary events, things like that. So that's typically where we're going to be. And often we find that folks who are disaster affected, whether they are homed or unhomed, will show up in those circumstances. Now, again, we've addressed a little bit this notion of trying to set people back up on their feet in a pre-disaster, function. And that's not always the most ethical approach when you're dealing with folks who are unhomed or unhoused. So it really does take a sort of an individual approach. We want to be able to support them through whatever their needs are, but at some point we have to acknowledge that this is a short-term effort, and then we're going to be referring folks back into their community for the longer term support that they need, whether that is emotional support or other types of social services that might be available. I think that may be as far as we can take it sometimes.
And I will touch on this. We do provide those immediate disaster mental health services to the unhoused after a disaster. It's a difficult situation to find them a place to go, but we will provide sheltering for them immediately and work with them in our shelters until we can find a place, working with local DSS to get them housed and provide them the long-term services that they need.
And if I could just really quickly touch on it as well, I think the Division of Homeland Security and the Office of Emergency Management, in coordination with a lot of counties, unfortunately, most of the disasters that we face in New York State as a state are our winter storm season, our cold season, and there has been a lot put into the development of code blue shelters. I know during the last severe winter weather event out in Buffalo, not only were there shelters for people who may have been stuck in the storm to go to, but there were also plenty of code blue shelters set up as well. And there were services being set up at those code blue shelters for those that were unhomed to assist them. And not only that, but I know OMH as an agency has put a lot of effort into the homeless population and the unhoused population, and trying to provide services to that community. So again, being able to not only during a disaster, but during normal everyday blue sky events as well, is providing those services whenever possible.
Thank you. And I know I said this would be the last question, but one other one, really good one, just came in, if you guys don't mind. How are organizations utilizing technology to improve disaster mental health response activities outside of trainings, i.e. increasing access to services, filling provider gaps, etc.?
We are always improving our technology. We have created a new system for our shelters that we can identify the people in the shelters and what their needs are, not just that they're there, but try to identify their individual needs. And that's a computerized system that we're using called Skya to try and help improve what services people need. And then working with the client care teams to determine how we can best meet those needs.
You know, I might point to the development, especially through COVID, of the virtual capacity to provide support for folks. You know, I know a lot of agencies are working through that, and there's a lot of support for that. There's a lot of money to enable it, available nationwide. I think also, you know, we in particular are working with partners at 988 and 211 to ensure that those kinds of resources are available to folks. There are resources through SAMHSA and FEMA as well that people can call for emotional support as well. And then I think in the background, there's a lot that we're doing in terms of providing resources and tools that folks can use online to be able to either support themselves and their own emotional wellness, and to support those who are responding in the community. Yeah.
Thank you, Skip. And I think that actually goes very well into our final question here. How does each of the organizations on the panel provide peer support and things like critical incident stress management to their own disaster responders? What does their support to their own responders look like?
Pat, that might be one for you for OMAs. What do you think?
One of the things each of our facilities has what's considered a trauma response team within the facility themselves. There is a policy on the books for OMH that each of our facilities has one of those teams. And those are comprised of people that can do things like critical incident stress management, but they also do PFA. They also do our own in-home version of workplace violence, responding to workplace violence. But we do support each of these teams through our state EAP programs with resources for mental health. We also, in our agency as a whole, we have a wellness program that promotes things like mind, body, breath, wellness, meditation, and different types of ways to deal with stressors of not only the regular work week, but also when responding to some sort of traumatic event.
As I said earlier, our supervisors are mental health and spiritual care, because that's another service that's very much part of our working with the folks and disaster. They evaluate their own teams. They will also touch base every day with the workers to make sure that our staff is doing okay. Ask them, how are you today? What do you need? How can I help you? That kind of stuff. And then we also have a generated every day a check-in. Do you need anything? And it comes to your cell phone and checking on your wellness and make sure everything's okay. You've got a place to stay. Everything is going okay for you. That's really how we handle it each day.
And one more thing for our disaster mental health response teams, in the past, it's been part of the training, part of learning collaboratives was to make sure you're checking in on your team, your teammates, and everybody else at the DRC. Part of your job as a responder is also to check in on everybody else that's responding, is to look for those signs that people are under stress. You know, maybe grab a bottle of water for one of your other fellow responders and say, hey, do you need to take a break? So keeping your eyes open, not only to your own personal stress levels, but the stress levels of those who are responding around you.
Yeah, we always recommend finding a disaster buddy who you're kind of keeping an eye on each other, because it's often easier for people outside to spot those early warning signs than for us to perceive them in ourselves. All right, great. Well, some great audience questions. Thank you all for submitting those. Thank you, Andrew, for moderating those. Tom, Rachel, if you don't have anything to add, then I will wrap things up. take that as a yes.
No, Carla,
Okay.
I don't have anything to add.
Okay, thanks, Tom. All right, so thank you all so much. Thank you to our panelists, Jerry DeLuca of the American Red Cross and Skip Zimmerman and Patrick Riley of the New York State Office of Mental Health, Bureau of Emergency Preparedness and Response. Someday I will learn to just say that more smoothly, but this is not that day. But thank you all so much for sharing your expertise and your insights with us today. We also thank the staff of the Office of Health Equity and Human Rights at the Department of Health who were unable to attend the panel as we were hoping. And I also thank my IDMH colleagues, Chrissy Lawler and Andrew O'Mara, for their support. So also many thanks to all of those in the audience for everything you do to serve your communities, whatever your organization and your roles are. We really hope that this webcast has helped you understand those nuts and bolts of how to incorporate mental health resources into disaster planning and response. So as we said before, we strongly encourage everyone to pursue those additional trainings, ICS for the kind of structural understanding, psychological first aid for the more kind of stress management side of things. You can reach out to Pat or Skip about their trainings at OMH, the ones more targeted to the mental health professionals. As I said, there is a recorded version for the general audience on LMS, and then we will have those live virtual deliveries May 21st, June 3rd, and June 14th. And I believe those are already available to register for in LMS as well. More notes. Generally, if you have questions about requesting disaster mental health resources to support a response operation, we recommend you get in touch with your local emergency manager or emergency preparedness staff. So that wraps up this year's webcast. On behalf of the Institute for Disaster Mental Health and our partners in this event, Tom Henry and Rachel Colburn of New York State Department of Health, with guidance from Paula Tambasco at Office of Mental Health. Thank you for joining us, and be well. And we'll give you back 8 minutes of your lives, but we really appreciate everyone making the time for this and hope it was actually helpful for everyone. So thank you all so much.